I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that straight. This executive order, quote, authorizes the plans and assigns the responsibilities for a complete takeover by the government of every facet of life if the president decides that such action is necessary, unquote. The plans are intended for use in, quote, any emergency situation, unquote, and nowhere in the executive order is that phrase defined. Now, some believe that that authorizes the president to move workers from one part of the country to another, whether they want to go or not, just like Marx envisioned an industrial army. Marx's ninth plank, number 61, called for a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Now, this is very interesting. There are many who believe that there are too many people on the earth, and we're going to cover this very further, in a short time, to show you that this statement is not true. But anyway, there are a lot of people that do believe that, and that there are too many of these people, and that they've congregated themselves in cities around the world, and not enough in the rural areas or in the farmlands. Marx said that the communists would make certain that this disparity would not continue by moving people from one part of the country to another, as the government so decreed. If the American government decided that this assumption was correct, where would it put all of the people it moved to a new area? How would it know who had extra rooms in their home to put up their new neighbors who were moved by the government? One way it would know would be to ask its citizens just how much spare room they had in their home. Now, they did that, by the way, in the 1980 census. I've got a copy of it here. We're going to read some of the questions that our government asked us in 1980. This is a copy of the 1980 census. There it is. 1980 census of the United States. It's the last one taken on April the 1st, 1980. Now, I'm going to open it up here, and we're going to read some of the questions that our government asked us during that census of 1980. Now, I know you can't read this, you'll have to trust me, but how many living quarters, occupied and vacant, are at this address? Do you enter your living quarters directly from the outside or through a common or public hall, or through someone else's living quarters? Do you have complete plumbing facilities in your living quarters? That is, hot and cold piped water, a flush toilet, and a bathtub or shower. How many rooms do you have in your living quarters? Is this house on a property of 10 or more acres? It says over here, do you get water from a public system or from a well? Do you have complete kitchen facilities? How many bedrooms do you have? How many bathrooms do you have? How many automobiles are kept at home for use by members of your household? And how many vans or trucks of 1-ton capacity or less are kept at home for use by members of your household? Now, that's interesting. Let's take a look at this and see whether or not the government had the authority to ask those questions. I want to go back to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, and the 14th Amendment. Both of these documents, or both of these articles, specify how this census is going to be conducted and for what purpose. And of course, these two things require that a census be conducted every 10 years. That is constitutional. It is required that our government take a census by the Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, and the 14th Amendment. And they very clearly say that the purpose of that census is to count the number of people in America to apportion the Congress. That is the only reason the census can be taken. Those are the only questions they can ask you. How many people are there here, and where do you live? And the reason they need that information is to apportion the Congress of the United States. There is no other authority in that census, in that Constitution. A few years ago, back I believe in 1973 or 76, sometime, we'll cover this once again later, our government created an agency called the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, F-E-M-A. It was created by an executive order, by the way, which was unconstitutional, by Jimmy Carter. And under that, there are many who believe it grants the government the authority to move people from one city to another, just like Marx envisioned. Let's cover the last plank of the platform, number 62. This is the 10th plank. Marx called for the free education for all children in public schools. Now, why did Marx want the government to teach all children in a public school? Why? Because he wanted the state to teach what the state, he, the communist, wanted taught. Later, we're going to cover how and why private education in America today is being destroyed by the government and also the various state governments, and we'll discuss that in great detail to show you that number 10, the free education publicly for all children, is coming true in America just as Marx envisioned. Now, during that review of the 10 planks of Marx's program, we noticed the years 1913 to 1916 coming up quite frequently, didn't we? All of those documents, all of those planks, there's 3 or 4 of them, came in those 3 or 4 years. Now, we've got to ask our question, who gave those things to us? Who was the president between 1913 and 1916? Number 63. The president of the United States was Woodrow Wilson. Who was his advisor? The man who gave him his advice on what to do, Colonel Edward Mandell House. Woodrow Wilson, president, Colonel House, his advisor. Now I'm going to show you a picture of these two gentlemen, Colonel House and President Woodrow Wilson together, to show you that these two people were contemporaries and in fact were close friends. That's House on the left and President Wilson on the right. Please remember Colonel House and also Woodrow Wilson. We're going to cover them throughout this series to show you how closely they worked to give us many of Marx's planks and platforms. Wilson later said that Colonel House was, quote, or said rather that House's ideas, let me reread that. Wilson later said that, quote, House's thoughts and mine are one, unquote. So Wilson said, my ideas are just the same as those of House. What were the thoughts of House? We're going to find out here briefly in the next few minutes to show you just what Colonel Edward Mandell House envisioned for America. Colonel House wrote this book entitled Philip Drew, Administrator. In this book, Philip Drew, the hero of the book, takes over the government of the United States. And on page 45 of this book, House has his hero, Drew, give America, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, unquote. Let me repeat that. In this book, Philip Drew, Administrator, Colonel House, the advisor to Woodrow Wilson, the man who said that his thoughts were identical to Woodrow Wilson's, gives America socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, unquote. Philip Drew gives America in this novel the graduated income tax, the inheritance tax. He restricts the individual's right to private property, just like Marx's second, third, and first planks of his program to communize a, quote, most advanced country, unquote, like America. House in this book later went on to say that he himself saw himself in his hero, Philip Drew. One author has written, quote, Philip Drew was what he, meaning House, himself would like to have been, unquote. Every act in his career, every word of advice to Woodrow Wilson was consistent with the ideas enunciated by Philip Drew. In other words, Philip Drew and Colonel House were the same man. He gave socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx through Woodrow Wilson during Wilson's administration between 1913 and 1916. That's why we got the graduated income tax in 1913, the inheritance tax in 1913, and the central bank, of the inheritance tax rather, in 1916, and the central bank in 1913. We got socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, unquote, through Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House. Now, I invite you to read that book, Philip Drew, Administrator, for yourself to see whether I'm telling you the truth. Let's talk now once again about the God-given right to private property. Marx wrote number 64. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. That is just what we intend, unquote. Marx wants to abolish private property. Now I want to show you an article that appeared in the April 10th, 1972 Portland Oregonian. That's Portland, Oregon, and this is their morning newspaper, I believe. And the article says that, as you can see, that this was a report, an article about the 1972 Oregon Democratic Party Annual Convention. Now, I don't show it to you, but on the bottom of the article, it says this plank in a platform passed by the Oregon Democrats says, number 65, quote, "Land is a common resource and should be held in public ownership," unquote. Now, who controlled Oregon's Democratic Party in 1972? Was it those who wanted to support the right to own private property? Or was it those who believed in socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx? The communists controlled the 1972 Oregon Democratic Party, and I didn't say that. You can read it yourself. And that's how close the communists are even today in America. Now let's discuss another revolution, the Communist Revolution of 1917 in Russia. I want to start with the real reason for the Russian Revolution. I want to go back to 1859 with the discovery of oil in America by Edward L. Drake. Edward Drake drilled the first American oil well, but someone else saw the enormous potential for profit in oil, and that individual was John David Rockefeller. Now, this is the grandfather of the David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller, one of our vice presidents recently. And John D. Rockefeller started with two other partners in 1863 when they operated an oil refinery. Standard Oil, which was the name of that oil company, had this kind of control, number 66, of the refining capacity in America. Between 1863, when he started, and 1872, Standard Oil, which was Rockefeller's oil company, controlled 25% of America's refining capacity, which was, of course, a very small percentage in a very small oil industry. But by 1879, Rockefeller controlled 95% of America's oil refining capacity. In other words, Rockefeller had consolidated his control in the United States. So not only was Rockefeller satisfied that he had now controlled almost all of the oil refining capacity in the United States, he decided to go worldwide with this and started selling oil in the other countries around the world. And by 1884, there was only one place you could get oil, and that was the United States. And Rockefeller controlled 90% of the world's oil source from the United States. However, in 1883, the Tsar of Russia invited the Nobel brothers and the French branch of the Rothschild banking system to develop Russia's oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains near Baku, Russia. This action soon created an international competitor for the American oil industry. And by 1888, Russia had overtaken the United States in production of crude oil. Number 67. According to the Americana Encyclopedia, in 1891, the United States produced 62% of the world's total, and Russia produced 38% of the world's oil supply. However, just 10 years later, the United States had lost that major control and had gone to 39% rather, of the oil supply, and Russia was now controlling 61% of the oil supply. Now that's very interesting, isn't it? In other words, they nearly reversed themselves. The Russian government now was starting to control the world's oil supply and not the United States. Let me show you that in a graph form, number 68. Here we have petroleum production in the years 1860, 1885, and 1901. Now I don't know why they show this in tons. I don't know what that's got to do with an oil, but anyway, that's the way the figures came out of the research I did. In 1860, the United States produced 70,000 tons of oil, and the USSR 1,300 tons. That was when the Rockefellers, just before the Rockefellers started their control of the United States oil supply. By 1885, the United States was producing 3.12 million tons, and the USSR was producing 2 million tons. As you can see, they're rapidly gaining now on the United States. In 1901, the oil supply, the oil purchases had increased to 9.9 million tons, 9.92 million tons, and the Russians were now exporting or selling totally 12.17 million tons. Here you can see quite graphically how the United States was surpassed in oil production by the Baku oil fields produced by and developed by the Rothschilds and the French Rothschilds and the Nobel brothers. So now we're going to say, was the revolution necessary in Russia? Some don't believe so, and this book, called Before the Storm, was written by Baron C. Wrangel, I'll pronounce that the best I can, Rokossowski. And this little booklet was written by an anti-communist, a Russian anti-communist, after the revolution. And this is what he says. This author says, number 69, the Russian Revolution came after more than a half-century of the most rapid and comprehensive economic progress. In other words, we have a report from a Russian that this oil money that was coming into Russia in millions of billions of dollars apparently was developing a middle class in Russia. Now I want you to notice that as we've discussed in the past, the subject of the Communist Revolution has always been the middle class, a rising middle class. And we're going to see what happened to Russia's middle class that was being developed by the Tsar and this oil money. A second book was written by a general. It's called Tsarism and Revolution. Once again, this is the dust cover, kind of badly beaten up, but it's an older book that I've had for some time in my collection. But it was written by Arseny Degulovich, a Russian general. And he makes the same point, that the Tsar of Russia was actually developing a middle class prior to the Russian Revolution. So now the question is, was the Russian Revolution really necessary? There are really basically two reasons why the Russian Revolution occurred. Number one was the Tsar of Russia was producing a middle class. As I said, that has always been the subject of the Communist Revolution. And we're going to study other revolutions to show you that in every case where the country starts developing a middle class after having no middle class, the communists have a revolution. And we're going to see why. But the major reason the Russian Revolution occurred was Rockefeller and the other American oil interests wanted Russian oil. Today, it's been reported that the Rockefellers and other oil companies produce Russia's oil. And we're going to see that later when we study the Russian Revolution and aid and trade more in detail. And some of the American oil producers decided that they had to change the form of government in Russia so that they could control Russia's oil supply themselves. In other words, they had to replace the Rothschilds and the Nobel brothers with Americans and Europeans. But there were other forces at work in Russia working for a revolution, number 70. After the defeat of Napoleon and the occupation of Paris in 1814 by Russian troops, many Russian aristocrats visited France, unquote. The liberal ideas of the French Revolution. Now I'd like to pause here and ask what those liberal ideas were. They were the liberal ideas of the Illuminati, those who had planned the revolution. In other words, the liberal ideas of the Illuminati were the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. Let's return now to the rest of that quote. We're going to change that phrase. Number 70. The liberal ideas of the Illuminati appealed to many of them and resulted in the formation of two secret Masonic lodges, the Northern Star and the Southern Star in Russia. Both lodges enlisted as members many influential and wealthy Russian nobles. The Illuminati had been brought to Russia. And who joined it? The wealthy and the influential. Another author, George Katkoff, in his book Russia 1917, observed this, number 71. There is no doubt that a widespread net of conspiratorial organizations modeled on Freemasons' lodges worked for revolution in Russia and played a decisive role in the formation of the first provisional government. So here we see that the Masons were playing a key role in the revolution. The Masonic Lodge, the illuminated Masonic Lodge, was now in Russia. So we had two forces at work for revolution in Russia, the Illuminati and the American oil producers and the bankers who financed those American oil producers. The third force, the force that was to actually foment the revolution, was the communists and their visible leader, Nikolai Lenin. Nikolai Lenin learned about revolution from Sergei Nechayev, who wrote this the Revolutionary Catechism. Now, if you had a copy of this little document, you would find it was not very big. It's a very small little pamphlet, about maybe 4 or 5 pages long, but this is the key to the Russian Revolution. This little pamphlet details how a revolutionary can use violence to come to power. Sergei Nechaev's The Revolutionary Catechism. Lenin used these writings to overthrow the Tsar by bringing bloody revolution to Russia. Lenin called Nechaev number 1, this titanic revolutionary who gave his thoughts such startling formulation that they were forever printed on the memory. This titanic revolutionary. These writings have been called the real secret that makes communism work. Now, what did Nechaev write for the communists to read and for Lenin to read? What is the real secret of communism? Let's read part of that Revolutionary Catechism. Nechaev wrote number 2, "The revolutionary has broken all of the bonds which tie him to the social order and the civilized world, with all its laws, moralities, and customs. If he continues to live with them, it is only to destroy them more speedily. He knows only the science of destruction. The object is perpetually the same, the surest and quickest way of destroying the whole filthy order. The revolutionary despises and hates the existing social morality. For him, morality is everything which contributes to the triumph of the revolution. The revolutionary is merciless towards the educated classes. Between him and them, there exists a relentless and irreconcilable war to the death. To the death. He must be tyrannical towards others. Night and day, he must have but one thought, one aim, merciless destruction," Nechaev wrote. He must be prepared to destroy himself and to destroy everything that stands in the path of the revolution. A revolutionary should not hesitate to destroy any position, any place, or any man in this world. He must hate everyone and everything in it. This filthy social order can be split up into several categories, according to Nechaev. The first comprises those who must be condemned to death without delay, according to the gravity of their crimes. Their violent and sudden deaths will produce the utmost panic in the government. The second category consists of brutes in high positions while enjoying riches, influence, power, and high positions. These must be exploited. The third category comprises ambitious office holders and liberals. By the way, liberals, pay attention. They're talking here about you. The third category comprises ambitious office holders and liberals of various shades of opinion. The revolutionary must pretend to corroborate with them until they are completely in his power. He continues, number 3, Nechaev wrote, "The only form of revolution beneficial to the people is one which destroys the entire state to the roots and exterminates all the state traditions, institutions, and classes." Now, Robert Payne, an author who's written several books, I believe, about Lenin, wrote one book in particular called The Life and Death of Lenin. And Robert Payne said this about the connection between Lenin and Nechaev. He wrote, number 4, "The Revolutionary Catechism in all its essentials would remain the guiding principle of Lenin's political activity," unquote. Now that we know that Lenin believed in murdering of innocent people to come to power, that he was going to overthrow the filthy social order, as Nechaev called it, we can now ask the question, what was the cost of the Russian Communist Revolution? Number 5. The cost of the Russian Revolution, the cost of Lenin, as we're going to see later again, was between 22 and 45 million dead people. Here we can see that Lenin, who read Nechaev, said the revolutionary must destroy, must kill, believed it, and didn't care that between 22 145 million people died in the bloody communist revolution. In 1895, a young Lenin organized the League for the Liberation of the Working Class. And in 1898, Lenin formed the Social Democratic Labor Party. And with Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, and Stalin, of course, later became the dictator of Russia during the war and shortly thereafter. Lenin's revolutionary career began while he was at the University of Kazan, or I'll pronounce it that way, it's Kazan maybe, K-A-Z-A-N, when he became a devotee of Karl Marx. Now it's interesting that Karl Marx went to college and there became a communist. Fidel Castro went to college and there he became a communist. And now we see that Lenin went to college and there became a communist. In 1905, just a few years later, Lenin went to London, where he met with a group called the Fabian Society. We're going to cover the Fabian Society a little later in this series to show you who they are. But it was there in London that Lenin met many wealthy American and British bankers and industrialists who were there to loan Lenin money for the Russian Revolution. In addition, John Maynard Keynes, later to become one of the world's leading economists and advisor to President Franklin Roosevelt, was in attendance and met Lenin. John Maynard Keynes and Lenin were contemporaries and, in fact, friends. Later, in 1917, Keynes wrote to his mother, number 72. Keynes wrote, "Well, the only course open to me is to be buoyantly Bolshevik." Lenin was also buoyantly Bolshevik because he was the leader of the Bolshevik branch of the Communist Party. So here we see that John Maynard Keynes was admitting that he was a communist, a Bolshevik communist. And John Maynard Keynes later became an economic advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. Isn't that interesting? Now there was another problem in 1905 for the Tsar of Russia to worry about. There was a war between Russia and Japan. Japan's war was being financed by many of the same bankers who were financing Lenin's revolution, including Jacob Schiff, J.P. Morgan, the First National Bank, and the National City Bank. These bankers loaned Japan over $30 million to fight a war on the eastern borders of Russia to remove troops the Tsar needed to fight the communists in the major cities in the western half. Now we're going to have to break here because we're running out of time, but we're going to pick it up there next week with our continuation of our study of the Communist Revolution, and we're going to see how the wealthy financed it, what they bought, what the costs were, etc. We're going to study the Communist Revolution. As we've already seen, it wasn't necessary, but we're going to study it next week as we continue. So I invite you to tune us in again next week as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.
The contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I am the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I've been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I wrote my book entitled The Unseen Hand and published it myself. It's called The Unseen Hand, and I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. We'll be reviewing many of the contents of this book in this series. Tonight's session is number 9 in the series, and tonight we're going to continue our study of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. And we're going to continue our discussion and try to find out what the real reason for the revolution. What was the real reason? Why did they fight the darn thing? We're also going to examine later on in the series tonight the deaths of the Tsar of Russia and his family, 7 members in total. And we're going to show you the evidence that proves to me at least that the Tsar of Russia and his family did not die, as we've been told by those who write the accidental view of history. They actually survived, and in fact, we're going to see that some of them are even alive even today. But hold that thought, we'll see that a little bit later. Well, let's go back now to the 1905 period, and we'll start the first of the 2 revolutions, the 1905 Communist Revolution, and it started on May the 1st, 1905. Now, I'm sure that it's a coincidence that the Communists started that revolution on the anniversary of the founding of the Illuminati by Adam Weishaupt on May the 1st, 1776. At least that's what we're told. It's just a coincidence. I don't think it is at all, and we're going to see that I believe that Lenin was perhaps not a member of the Illuminati, but he was quite aware that they were their predecessors and that that's why he started the revolution on May the 1st. The Tsar of Russia responded to the revolution of 1905 by doing some very important things to further give power, or to start giving power to the people. He recognized the principle of a limited government. He established a national parliament with the power to share in the lawmaking process, and also proclaimed a set of fundamental laws that were out to protect the individual. Even with these changes, the revolution continued, because the revolution was not fought to give power to the people, as we're going to see. But the revolutionaries were not successful in 1905, and the Tsar exiled the 3 main communist leaders. And we're going to study all 3 of these in the next series, and then this series tonight, and probably throughout the next couple of nights afterwards. Lenin, the communist, went to Switzerland. Leon Trotsky came to the United States, and Joseph Stalin went to Siberia. And we're going to cover those 3 in a few minutes again. Tsar Nicholas, the Tsar of Russia at the time in 1913, was probably the richest man in the world. His worth has been estimated to be between 20 and 30 billion, with a B, billion dollars. And of course that's in money measured in 1913. So he's probably today would have been extremely wealthy. The Tsar did what I consider to be an extremely puzzling thing in 1905. He took some of that wealth and deposited it in fact, let's make sure, well, I'll give you the exact amount. He deposited $400 million into the Chase Bank of New York, the National City Bank of New York, the Guarantee Bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, the Hanover Bank, and the Manufacturers Trust Bank. All of these banks are in New York, or in United States rather, and many have questioned why he did that, and I'm one of them. I don't know, and we'll discuss that further in a few minutes. He also deposited over $80 million into the Rothschild banks of Paris. Now, as we discussed last week, we saw that these were the banks that were financing the Japanese war against the Tsar of 1905. We're also going to see other efforts of theirs to destroy the Tsar in a few minutes. Now, I don't know why the Tsar put that quantity of money into those banks, but my theory is that he must have felt he could buy back his country from the bankers who were financing the revolution and the war in Japan against him. No other explanation makes sense. In other words, I think he was just saying to those bankers, please leave me alone. The revolution started again after the 1905 unsuccessful attempt, and this time they were even more successful. The Tsar abdicated on March the 15th, 1917, to a provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky, not a communist, but a socialist. By the way, Kerensky was a 32nd degree Mason. And please hold that thought. We're going to see why that's important in a few minutes. Kerensky admitted, number 73, we received some support privately from industry in America. Notice, Kerensky admitted in a U.S. News and World Report interview in 1967, we got some money from private industry in America. Now, why would they want to support Kerensky? As far as I know, Kerensky never said who those private interests were. I think it would be interesting to find out, but we're going to examine some others who know where that money came from. Kerensky issued a political amnesty to all of the revolutionaries, and back came the communists. Leon Trotsky, as I said, was in New York. Leon Trotsky, one of the three primaries in this revolution, was in the city of New York. Now, while he was there, Leon Trotsky was being financed by someone, and we're going to examine that question. Who was financing Trotsky? By coincidence, it was the same people who bought Marxist philosophy, the very wealthy. Trotsky got over $20 million from J.P. Morgan, certain Rockefeller interests, and from W.B. Thompson, the director of the private reserve bank in the New York City. As I said, Trotsky was in New York and boarded a ship bound for Sweden on March the 27th, 1917, for his return to Russia. When he reached Halifax, Canada, he was arrested by the Canadian government. He was carrying an American passport, so the Canadian government corresponded with the American government. They wanted to know why the Wilson administration had issued Trotsky permission to leave Russia. Canada was at war with Germany in World War I, and Canadians were being killed by German soldiers in the Western Front. Germany was also at war with Russia, and Canada's concern was that Trotsky, if the revolution they saw coming in Russia was successful, Trotsky would sign a peace treaty with Germany, ending the war between those two nations. This would release German troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, endangering the lives of more Canadian soldiers. They reasoned that the American government would share their concern because the peace treaty would increase the danger to American soldiers in the war fighting Germany. In other words, Germans would come from the Russian front over to the Western Front and engage Canadian and American soldiers. And they said America would share our concern because we fear that Trotsky would sign a peace treaty. The Wilson administration put pressure on the Canadian government to release Trotsky, and they did. When Trotsky reached Russia, and after the Communist Revolution put the Bolshevik communists in power, Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin signed a peace treaty with Germany, ending the war. And just like the Canadians feared, German soldiers moved from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to kill Canadian and American soldiers. Woodrow Wilson. Lenin was in Switzerland and had to get through a war zone to reach Sweden. Lenin the communist. So the German high command put him aboard a sealed railroad train guarded by German soldiers and spirited him to Sweden. It is interesting when you think that Lenin was a Russian and Russia was at war with Germany. In other words, why did they do that? This was the enemy. He should have been tried as an enemy agent or a spy or something. But they put him in a train and got him through the war to Sweden. So the Germans should have had nothing to do with Lenin, but they did, and Lenin went to Sweden. When Lenin got there, he received $5 million from Max Warburg, brother of Paul Warburg, chairman of the Private Reserve. By the way, if you have not heard previous sessions, when I say private reserve, I'm talking about what you, those who don't understand, call the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is not federal, it's private. So I'm on a one-man crusade to call it what it is, the private reserve. Now this is Jacob Schiff, an international banker. His grandson, John Schiff, estimated that his grandfather loaned about $20 million to the Bolshevik communists for their revolution. This cooperation between the Marxists and the wealthy bankers was the subject of a political cartoon by Robert Miner in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1911. It shows here Karl Marx on Wall Street in the center, surrounded by an appreciative audience of Wall Street financiers. From the left, we see, drawn in the cartoon, J.P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan partner George Perkins, J.P. Morgan himself, Teddy Roosevelt, John D. Ryan of the National City Bank, and John D. Rockefeller. And notice they're all smiling. This cartoonist understood. The wealthy capitalists and the communists are allies, not enemies. Now we'll see this over and over again throughout this series. The wealthy are the allies of the communists, not their enemies. Now what was the final result of the revolution? The wealthy capitalists who loaned Lenin, the communists, the money for the revolution bought a nation. As we'll see in a later session, the price for their help was the nation itself, control of its central bank. Lenin became a god. Now this is an interesting drawing, or actually it's a photograph, and that's a painting of Lenin against a building. Now I don't know how big that building is, but estimating the height of the man on the bottom walking on the street at about 6 feet rather, the painting is about 72 feet high. So here we have Lenin becoming a god in Russia. Lenin wrote that there was no God but man himself, and in Russia there is no God but Lenin himself. The accidental view of history has recorded that the Tsar and his family were all murdered after being captured by the Bolsheviks. Now here's an example of that official position. Here we have number 74. This is written in a book that I read, and it says the 7 members of the imperial family, meaning the Tsar and his wife and his 5 children, were murdered on the night of July the 16th, 1918, in, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Ekaterinburg, Russia. I might be mispronouncing it, I don't know. After being shot, the bodies of the family were allegedly dumped into a well. But number 75, when people got there to find out about this, the media spread the news that these people had been murdered. So people went there, non-communists, even people from outside of the country, went there, and they found no bodies, bones, or skulls, or dental work of members of the imperial family were ever found. And yet we've been told for centuries, or since 1917 or 1918, that the royal family died in the house in Ekaterinburg, Russia, but no evidence of that crime was ever found. In the late 50s, a Polish general by the name of Michael Goleniewski, number 76, had infiltrated Polish communist intelligence and rose to the equivalent rank of general. I'll refer to him as a colonel, but he's really a general. The information obtained from this general was found to be accurate in all cases where it was checked out. From April 1958 to December 1960, this general reported on Soviet agents in Western nations. He named more than 2,000 communist spies. In each case where the government in the West tried that spy, he was convicted on this counterintelligence agent's testimony. In January of 1961, this colonel or general in the Polish intelligence defected to the United States. When he got here, he identified himself as Alexei Romanov, the son of the Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. He said, "I am the Tsarevich, the son of the Tsar." Shown in this picture side by side are young Alexei on the left and Alexei, the alleged Tsar himself, the Tsarevich, in his 50s. Now, I don't know much about checking photographic evidence, but it looks to me as if they're the same man, one a young boy and one the elder, the grown man. Now, this man claimed that Lenin agreed to save his family, meaning the Tsar and his family, when Lenin signed the peace treaty with Germany that had ended their involvement in World War I, and I believe that's true. It is known that the Tsar of Russia was a relative of the Kaiser of Germany, and it might be that the Kaiser wanted to protect his relative and his family. Herman Kimsey, K-I-M-S-E-Y, the former chief of research at the CIA in America, was asked to determine if Goleniewski's claims were accurate. He examined the evidence, such things as fingerprint comparisons from 1909 and 1961, sole print comparisons, meaning the foot, dental charts, blood tests, medical records, handwriting tests, scars, leg deformities, and face prints. And on June the 3rd, 1965, Kimsey wrote number 77. I am convinced that Colonel Goleniewski is Alexei Romanov, son of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Our government's chief expert on such things said that he was indeed the son of the Tsar. Goleniewski claims that the Tsar died on May the 18th, 1952. That's his father. The Tsarevich also said, number 78, and this is very, very revealing. The Tsarevich said, if the United States will support me, there will be no Soviet Union. They, meaning the United States, didn't do so. Isn't that interesting? So even with the evidence, even with our own CIA investigating his charges, even with them proving them to be true, they didn't believe him. I want you to remember that the Tsar placed nearly $500 million in American banks and French banks in 1905. What do you think that money would be worth 80 years later? Presume that the son of the Tsar could prove that he was the legitimate heir to that fortune, and that he wanted to use that fortune against the bankers who removed his father from his rightful place and butchered millions of his countrymen. What position would you, as a banker, want the government to take with regard to the Tsarevich? And that's exactly the position they did take. They didn't believe him. They claimed he was not the Tsarevich. I want to refer you to 5 good books on this subject. I encourage you to read these if you wish. I'm going to hold them up one after the other, and you can read these to find out for yourself whether he was the Tsarevich. This book is called The Conspirator Who Saved the Romanovs. History's greatest secret finally exposed, the untold story of the incredible escape of the Russian imperial family. This book is called The Hunt for the Tsar, written by Guy Richards. Guy Richards has written 2 other books we'll bring to your attention in a few moments. This one's called The Hunt for the Tsar. Here's the 3rd book in the series, called Imperial Agent, The Goleniewski Romanov Case by Guy Richards, in which he discusses the man's claims. This is a rather thick book called The File on the Tsar, The Fate of the Romanovs, Dramatic New Evidence, by Anthony Summers and Tom Mangold. It also says the Tsarevich is who he claims to be. And lastly, this book called The Rescue of the Romanovs by Guy Richards. Newly discovered documents reveal how Tsar Nicholas II and the Russian imperial family escaped. Yet even today in our history books, we learn that the Tsar and his family died in 1918. Somebody's not telling you the truth. And I think that somebody wants us to believe that because the Tsarevich would get control of that fortune in the American banks and put an end to the Soviet Union, communism, the ally of the wealthy conspirators. After the communists took over, Lenin did 2 very interesting things. On November the 7th, 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the government and the Kerensky government, and Kerensky survived the revolution and was allowed to come to the West. Many people have believed that because Kerensky was an interim government and a member of the Masons and also received money from the private industry in America, he was part of the process, and that he was an interim government only to turn it over to Lenin, and I take that position as well. Kerensky's provisional government set November the 25th, 1917 as the general election. Leon Trotsky urged Lenin to hold the election, and Lenin reluctantly agreed. And the elections were held November the 25th, 1917, for the first and only time in Russia. These were the results with nearly 42 million votes cast. Number 79. A party called the Social Revolutionaries received 58% of the vote. The conservative and middle class parties received about 2 million votes, which is a small percentage, between them, and the Bolsheviks only got 30%. 30% of 42 million votes were cast, and only 30% said we want communism in our country. The people rejected it 2.5 to 1, yet the country went communist. Why? The people did not want communism, but they have it. Why? On November the 28th, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson, we've talked about him already in the past, about his connection with Colonel Edward Mandell House and the socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. But Woodrow Wilson ordered our government not to interfere with the Bolshevik Revolution. Stay out of this thing, he said. And on March the 5th, 1918, our U.S. legation in Bern, Switzerland, wrote to Woodrow Wilson, number 80. They said, people are asking why the president, meaning Woodrow Wilson, expresses support of the Bolsheviki, meaning the communists, in view of the rapine, and I looked up the word rapine, it means plunder, stealing, murder, and anarchy of these bands. So the U.S. legation in Bern knew the truth about what was happening in Switzerland, in Russia, wrote to Woodrow Wilson and said, why are you doing this? And Wilson did nothing. In other words, many couldn't understand our support of the Bolshevik Revolution when they were brutally murdering millions of their own citizens. Please remember Weishaupt's statement that the ends justify the means. These violent activities against the Russian people were acceptable to Lenin because they were assisting him to reach his goal of communism. I'd like to review other similarities between the writings of Lenin and Weishaupt. Lenin wrote, number 81, our power does not know liberty or justice. It is entirely established on the destruction of the individual will. We are the masters. Complete indifference to suffering is our duty. In the fulfillment of our calling, the greatest cruelty is a merit. Lenin wrote, the greatest cruelty is a merit. You can't say it any clearer than that. Lenin continued, number 82, through a systematic terror during which every breach of contract, every treason, every lie will be lawful, we will find the way to abase humanity down to the lowest level of existence. That is indispensable to the establishment of our dominance. The greatest cruelty is a merit. Some don't agree with Lenin. Now, this is Armand Hammer, one of America's wealthiest capitalists and a friend of Lenin's, and he's still in the news every once in a while, as we're going to see. And Armand Hammer said this, number 83, Lenin has been called ruthless and fanatical, cruel and cold. I refuse to believe it. It was his intense human sympathy, his warm personal magnetism, and utter lack of self-assertion or self-interest that made him great. I ask you this question. Are we to believe Armand Hammer or Lenin himself? Let me repeat what Lenin wrote. The greatest cruelty is a merit. In his biography, Armand Hammer included a picture that Lenin personally autographed to him. It is signed, quote, to Comrade Armand, unquote. Now these two are supposed to be the greatest of enemies. When you go and study communism at the universities and colleges, you learn that the communists and the capitalists, the wealthy, are supposed to be enemies. Yet here we have Armand and Comrade Lenin and Comrade Armand sharing nice little pictures, and one saying that they're not brutal and cruel. Yet they're shown, as I said, as good friends. In 1973, Hammer's company, Occidental Petroleum Corporation, signed a $20 billion chemical deal with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, meaning Russia. In other words, I guess it pays to say nice things about Nikolai Lenin. You get to sign $20 billion deals. After the communists took over, Lenin did two very interesting things, as I said. On November the 8th, 1917, Lenin said, number 84, the right of private property in land is forever abolished. Now you remember that Karl Marx had written plank number 1 of his Communist Manifesto, the abolition of private property. So this action was consistent with the teachings of his mentor, Karl Marx, the one that he learned about when he went to the university. And later Lenin did this, number 85. One of the first acts of the Russian communists in 1917 was to dissolve all Masonic lodges. Now, why did Lenin do that? I don't know. But I want to guess that it was because the Masons who had assisted Lenin in the violent revolution were not going to get the power that they thought they were going to obtain. And Lenin could not trust them to plot against him in their secret lodges and in their secret meetings. So Lenin dissolved the lodges. The third thing Lenin did was not very strange. He had to destroy the middle class in Russia, so he increased the money supply to destroy the value of money. Number 86. The number of rubles in circulation increased nearly 20,000 times from 1921 to 1923. Now I want to have point something out very interesting. A few years ago, I decided to go back to college, and I went to a university in Oregon while I was working up there, and I took a class in economics, a junior level class. Now, I'm a college graduate, so I was taking this junior level class because I wanted to get my master's. So anyway, I took the class, and in that class we learned all about inflation. It was not caused by an increase in money supply. So like a dummy, I stood up in the class, or at least I sat down and asked the instructor, I said, please tell me whether or not an increase in the money supply causes inflation. She said, oh, no, absolutely not. I said, then why did Lenin increase the money supply 20,000 times in 3 years? Well, she said, it's obvious that he wanted to end unemployment, and that's the reason he did that. I said, why did he do it 20,000 times then? Why not just double or triple it? She says, I don't know, but it's obvious he wanted to end unemployment. No, it's not obvious. Lenin had to destroy the middle class for the very wealthy, and he did that through inflation. Now, he also did this because he had nationalized all the banking institutions under a decree of December the 14th, 1917. In other words, Lenin got control of the money supply by nationalizing all the banks and then started printing rubles to destroy the money of the middle class. Now, why did he have to destroy the why did he nationalize the banks? Let's say that. This is Professor Anthony Sutton, and Professor Sutton answered that question in this book entitled Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Professor Sutton has done a monumental research job to prove that Wall Street financed the Bolshevik Revolution. And in there he talks about how the American capitalists financed the revolution, and one of the things they got was a central bank. Let's read this rather interesting quote, number 87. Sutton wrote, in the fall of 1922, the Soviets formed their first international bank. It was based on a syndicate that involved the former Russian private bankers and some new investment from German, Swedish, American, and British bankers. Isn't that interesting? He nationalized the banks to create a central bank owned by foreign investors. This was in accordance with Marx's fifth plank, which called for a national bank with an exclusive monopoly on the printing of money. And we know what they did. They rapidly increased the quantity of money, destroying the middle class. The next step is also completely consistent with the banker's strategy for Russia, number 88. In 1929, the Communist government of Russia made it a crime for any citizen to retain gold in any form. Now the people of Russia had no way to fight the money lenders in Russia. They no longer had any real money, gold. The bankers were now in complete control of Russia. I'd like to mention lastly that the Nobels and the Rothschilds left Russia after the revolution, and the Rockefellers moved in. The oil industry of Russia was now in their hands. And with that activity, I believe that is probably the major reason for the Communist Revolution. We're going to study that later in this series and show you just how much of Russia is owned even today by the capitalists and financiers who financed the revolution. Now, once again, let's go back now. What was the cost of the revolution? In 1970, our government, as I said, I think I've already said this, issued a report that had determined, number 89, that between 22 and 45 million people have been executed, starved to death, or have died in prison. That apparently is the cost of buying a revolution. That is the cost of communizing a civilization. That is the cost of buying an oil industry. Between 22 and 45 million dead people. And the wealthy bought that revolution. But don't forget, it's a small price to pay for the bankers to pay for a national bank. Remember, the end justifies the means. But the main lesson to learn is that communism was not imposed from the bottom up. The people did not uprise spontaneously demanding the Tsar remove himself. It was imposed from the top down. The people did not revolt to demand communism. The bankers forced it down on the people. As I said, only 30% of the people who voted wanted communism. Now let's go back to this study. We've used this before in our series. This series of a study on the revolution in 1969 by Life magazine. It says, what are the causes? How does it start? Can it happen here? It was a series on revolution. I'm the one that put it in plastic. And let's go over here to 1917, and we're going to read a little paragraph, as soon as I can find it here, about the Russian Revolution. There it is. I'll hold it open here if you can see that. There's Lenin in the upper left-hand corner, and this is the story about the revolution of 1917. And we're going to read that paragraph right there. Number 90. Life magazine says, the Russian Revolution began spontaneously in an urban insurrection against a feudal regime. In other words, the people demanded the revolution. They demanded the Tsar abdicate. They wanted communism, according to Life magazine. Yet when you study the truth, the real facts of the revolution, you know that's not true. Somebody is lying. And I'm going to tell you later why Life magazine wrote that and why they believe the way they said, why they want us to believe that. We saw they said the same thing about the revolutions of 1789 and 1848, and now the Russian Revolution in 1917. I'd like to talk next about the Cuban Communist Revolution of 1956 to 1959. First, I'd like to talk briefly about the condition of Cuba prior to the Communist Revolution. Prior to 1956, number one, Cuba was third in the percentage of literacy amongst the people. These are, by the way, amongst the Latin American countries. It was first in the percentage of people being educated in Latin America. It had the lowest mortality rate in Latin America. It was second in the number of doctors per 1,000 people. It was first in the number of cars per person. It was fourth in wages per employee. It was second in per capita income. In other words, Cuba had a rising middle class. Remember that. Let me show you how Cuba's average worker was being paid prior to the revolution. Number two, in 1958, the hourly wage in Cuba was $3 an hour. In Belgium at that time, it was $2.70 an hour. In France, one of these advanced countries, it was $1.74 an hour. In the United States, it was only $4 an hour, $4.06 an hour. In other words, Cuba was paying about 75% of what we were, yet it was a backward country that needed communism. Cuba's standard of living was almost as high as that of Italy's in 1958 and was, at that time, higher than Japan's. Cuba was one of the most middle-class countries in Latin America. Why then did Cuba have a communist revolution? The communists had to destroy Cuba's middle class, and we're going to try to prove that in the next few minutes. One book said, number three, the Cuban Revolution was used to destroy the middle class. Here somebody admits it. That was the purpose of it, to destroy a rising middle class. After the revolution, number 4, anyone can observe the streets, recalling that once they were filled with autos, and now there are few. Although food items are limited, they are available. Other products are simply not to be had. Every Cuban has a ration book. Other things are in short supply as well. Look at this, number 5. The many activities, freedoms, and possessions that Americans consider necessary to happiness are either limited or unavailable. Now this is a picture of the Cuban paradise, the workers' paradise called communism, showing shoppers lined up for goods that don't exist. The communist revolution in Cuba has truly destroyed the middle class. Since the revolution, organized religion has markedly lost power. The greatest change was the takeover of the schools, always a large part of the Catholic Church's activities. In other words, remember Marx wrote, number 10, a free public education for all children. And in Cuba, the way to do that was to destroy religion so that the churches were no longer teaching the Cuban children. Author Fred Ward wrote a book entitled Inside Cuba. He actually went there and interviewed the Cubans. He wrote this, number 6, no one asked by the author in Cuba could answer the basic concern of any student of communism. If the system is so successful and desirable, why won't it work without the massive restrictions on individual freedom? Number 7, how many people have objected to communism? About 800,000 Cubans have immigrated to America since Fidel Castro seized power in 1959. In other words, the Cubans don't like communism either. It doesn't work. And the people are saying so by leaving the country. Fidel Castro started the revolution in December of 1956. He had first had about 82 followers, and the number later dwindled to 11 people. And by June of 1957, about 6 months later, there were only 30 communists in the hills. It doesn't sound to me like it's a very popular revolution, does it? Let's examine how Cuba became a communist nation. Fidel Castro moved from the mountains and took over Cuba on January the 1st, 1959. In Cuba, when Batista fled the country, Batista, by the way, was the man he was out to destroy and replace. Batista was a tyrant, we've been told. He was, of course, leading them into a middle class, but that doesn't matter. He was the tyrant, he had to be overthrown. So when he fled, an army of over 45,000 people, 45,000 soldiers, surrendered without a fight to only about 1,800 revolutionaries under Castro. The general who surrendered these forces was himself a member of the Communist Party. Now, isn't that interesting? The American ambassador to Cuba during the Communist Revolution was Earl T. Smith, and he said this, number 8, Castro could not have seized power in Cuba without the aid of the United States. American government agencies and the United States press played a major role in bringing Castro to power. The State Department consistently intervened to bring about the downfall of President Batista, thereby making it possible for Castro to take over the government of Cuba. Notice the ambassador figured it out. Cuba lost its freedom because our government, according to the ambassador, wanted it to go communist. Someone else agreed with Ambassador Smith. President John Kennedy himself said this, I think we spawned, constructed, entirely fabricated, without knowing it, the communist movement. Now let me give you some examples of how the press covered Fidel Castro. The Chicago Tribune said, quote, Castro is the Robin Hood of the Sierra Maestra, meaning the mountains, unquote. Edward R. Murrow on television did a favorable documentary on Fidel Castro. Ed Sullivan, who did the Toast of the Town or programs like that, who was the major TV show at that time in the 50s, did a filmed interview and called Castro, quote, the George Washington of Cuba, unquote. Look magazine in March of 1959 said, we can thank Our lucky stars, Castro was no communist, unquote. Newsweek in April of 1959 said, why has Castro, who is not himself even remotely a communist, unquote. Now we're going to see in a few minutes whether or not those statements are true. Who paid for the revolution? We can only get a few clues, but here's one of them. Senator Barry Goldwater wrote in his book, With No Apologies, number 9, Castro had an apparently inexhaustible source of money, unquote. Goldwater does not say who sent him that money, but we can gather, as I say, a few clues. One of the sources of the money was the CIA, according to an author by the name of Tad Zulk. I don't know how to pronounce it, S-Z-U-L-C, and he wrote a book entitled Fidel, A Critical Portrait. Mr. Zulk has written many books about Castro, and I've read several, but not this particular one. He said that the CIA channeled no less than $50,000 to Castro between October of 1957 and the middle of 1958. Now, how many of you taxpayers voted your tax money for the purpose of assisting Castro in Cuba take over the country? Of course, this is television, I can't see, but I would dare say that in fact I know this, if I walked amongst you and asked you, not one of you would have supported that use of your money. One of the major questions asked during the revolution was whether Castro was a communist before 1959 when he took over the Cuban government. The answer was he was, and there were plenty of people outside of the Castro movement and his revolutionaries who knew it. In 1948, there was an attempted communist takeover in Colombia, South America. Fidel Castro was there leading the revolution, and he led a student group into a radio station, and he said, quote, number 10, "This is Fidel Castro from Cuba. This is a communist revolution." Castro's radio speech was heard by William D. Pauley, former American ambassador to Brazil and Peru, who was in Bogota, Colombia, during the attempted revolution. In other words, someone who should know heard it and said it, that he heard it. There were others, however, who didn't believe Castro was a communist. Herbert Matthews, a reporter for the New York Times and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. By the way, we'll discuss them more in a couple of weeks, and you'll know more about that group. But Herbert Matthews, the reporter on the New York Times, wrote this on February 25th, 1957, number 11. "There is no communism to speak of in Fidel Castro's movement." He said Castro was, quote, "dedicated to liberty, democracy, and social justice," unquote. Now, Matthews became an instant expert because in February 1957, he made his way into the foothills in the Sierra Maestra, however you pronounce it, mountains, to see Castro's revolution firsthand. So now we know he's an expert. He was there. In 1957, the United States government learned that Matthews was wrong. Number 12. A complete dossier on Castro and the communists surrounding Castro, prepared by the G2 intelligence of the Cuban Army, was hand-carried to Washington in 1957 and delivered to Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. Allen Dulles was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the head of the CIA. As I said, Allen Dulles, CFR member and head of the CIA, did nothing with that report. Now we'll talk more, as I say, about this group called the CFR in later sessions. Now we'll see why they did nothing about the report to one of their key members, Allen Dulles. About this time, Castro told Jules Dubois, a magazine reporter, quote, number 13, "I have never been, nor am I, a communist." Okay, that's what he's told. He said us, so we're supposed to believe him. Matthews and others said he wasn't a communist. And our own government said that. In December of 1958, Roy Rubottom, Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs, said this, number 14, "There was no evidence of any organized communist elements within the Castro movement or that Senor Castro himself was under communist influence." So in April 1959, Castro came to the United Nations, and there he was called a distinguished leader. That's what they said, before he became dictator of Cuba. But some others knew. One was Major Pedro Diaz-Lanz, head of Fidel Castro's Air Force and Castro's personal pilot. And on July the 1st, 1959, this man came to America to tell us the truth. And he tried to tell the American people that he had first-hand knowledge. He was Castro's pilot who knew Castro, and he had knowledge that Castro was indeed a communist. Mr. Diaz-Lanz went on a nationwide tour, but few were listening. In other words, he tried to tell us the truth. About 2 weeks later, sometime in July, Herbert Matthews wrote, number 15, "This is not a communist revolution in any sense of the word, and there are no communists in positions of control." Obviously, he said he knew because he was there, and he called Castro a Cuban patriot. Later that year, in November of 1959, the deputy director of the CIA, General C.P. Cabell, testified that Castro was definitely not a communist. Someone was telling the truth, and someone was not. Was Major Diaz right, or was General C.P. Cabell right? Finally, Castro told the truth. On December the 2nd, 1961, Castro said, number 16, "I have been a communist since my teens," he said. He acknowledged that he was, quote, "taking Cuba down the path to communism," unquote. He also maintained that the world was also on the road to communism. He was a communist since his teens, he said. But even then, some did not believe him. According to the New York Tribune of December the 7th, 1961, Herbert Matthews, the reporter for the New York Times, said, quote, number 17, "Castro may say he's a Marxist-Leninist, but not really mean it. Oh, I see. He's just fooling. Castro was not really a communist. He's just kidding. He's having fun. It walks like a duck. It squawks like a duck. It looks like a duck, but it's in truth an elephant." That's what we're supposed to believe from Mr. Matthews. Major Pedro Diaz-Lanz was right, and General C.P. Cabell was wrong. The American government decided to assist the Cuban freedom fighters in returning to Cuba to overthrow Castro's government. The president at the time was Dwight David Eisenhower, and his head of the CIA was Allen Dulles, as I've already said. Both Dwight David Eisenhower and Allen Dulles were members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. The Eisenhower administration selected two possible sites for the invasion: the area around Trinidad, Cuba, and a place called the Bay of Pigs. Number 18. Trinidad had all of the advantages over the Bay of Pigs. Trinidad was about 100 miles farther from Havana, the seat of all of Castro's power. The people around Trinidad were basically anti-communists, and there was an airfield nearby to assist the invaders. In other words, if they needed supplies to be dropped in an airfield, they had it. It was right there. And should the revolution fail, there was a range of mountains nearby. It was felt that the invaders could flee to the mountains and start a Castro-type revolution in the event they were forced to by the Castro forces. So it was intended for them to go to it looks like, the Bay of the Trinidad site rather than the Bay of Pigs. Eisenhower appointed a committee of 6 gentlemen, 5 of whom were fellow members of the Council on Foreign Relations, to approve the plans, including the location of the invasion site. In November of 1960, as you know, John Kennedy was elected President of the United States. A short time after he was inaugurated, John Kennedy had a meeting with 12 of his advisors, including the National Security Council. 10 of those men were members of the CFR, and the 12 men selected the Bay of Pigs over the site at Trinidad. Number 19. According to the plan at the Bay of Pigs was to have no hidden reefs. In other words, it was going to be a shore-type landing, and they were concerned that these reefs, that the bay have no reefs to protect the ships and the landing craft. But in reality, there were underwater reefs, reefs so severe that they actually ripped 3 landing crafts open as they attempted to go ashore. The plan was to provide air cover to the troops on the ground, but in reality, none was provided. And Castro's Air Force soon ruled the skies. They actually sank 2 supply ships. Air cover was extremely important. Without the supplies, the soldiers ran out of ammunition within the first 24 hours of the invasion. According to the plan, the American government was to supply the anti-Castro Cubans around Cuba. In other words, other anti-Castros, to get them involved in the effort. We needed a popular uprising in truth to overthrow the Castro government. They did such a great job, this government plan, that they supplied the Cuban invaders with 30 different types of ammunition. Now the question you have to ask yourself, if there's 30 different types of ammunition in the invading crew, how do you share your ammunition if one man has too much and the other man has none? The man who has none loses because he has nothing to fight back with. It's almost as if you say it was murder. The plan was to coordinate the landing with anti-Castro forces in Cuba, but no contact was ever made with over 100 anti-Castro underground organizations, either in Cuba or out. According to the plan, a radio station was to set up to keep the Cuban people informed about the invasion. But in reality, conflicting messages were sent out. Radio Swan, SWAN, the CIA's shortwave broadcast station, gave one conflicting and false report after another, none of which were true. Actually, it's interesting, even with all these things against the Bay of Pigs invaders, within a few hours they controlled over 800 square miles of Cuba, but then the Air Force came in and assisted by sinking the ships. Actually, they discovered that Castro's soldiers were defecting and joining the anti-Castro forces, and they were getting workers who learned about the Bay of Pigs invasion to join as well. But it's interesting, the next step is Castro might have had advanced knowledge about the Bay of Pigs. On January the 10th, 1961, about 3 months prior to the April invasion, in January, 3 months prior, the New York Times had this article in it on January the 10th, 1961. The headline read, U.S. helps train anti-Castro force at secret Guatemalan air ground base, unquote. And they actually had a map of the secret ground at the training site on the first page of the New York Times. The article said, quote, opponents of the, and I don't know how to pronounce this, YDIGORAS, Idigoras administration, by the way, he was the current Guatemalan president, so opponents of the current Guatemalan president have insisted that the preparations are for an offensive against the Cuban regime of Premier Fidel Castro, and that they are being planned and directed, and to a great extent being paid for by the United States. So all that Castro had to do to learn about the Bay of Pigs was read the New York Times. 3 months prior to the Bay of Pigs, the New York Times told him that our government was assisting the Cubans to invade the country, to liberate the country from communism. But it didn't matter. The New York Times wanted that information out or they wouldn't have printed the story. The plan was excellent, but as I say, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. I believe it was planned to fail. Our government did not want the Bay of Pigs invasion to succeed. Our government did not want Castro out of power. They wanted him in power. They put him into power. They kept him there by the Bay of Pigs. After the Bay of Pigs was over, Castro's position in Latin America was strengthened. He had defeated the mighty United States and in their invasion, and he now could look with great pride at his accomplishments, and many Latin Americans believe that Castro was now the ruler, or at least the most powerful man inside of the Latin American area. U.S. prestige in the Latin American area went to an all-time low. I met a Christian minister by the name of Stuart McBurney about this time in the early 60s after the Bay of Pigs, and he told me that he had just come from Latin America, and he said that the Latin Americans down there were telling him that Latin Americans had learned the lesson from the Bay of Pigs. We couldn't count on the United States' support for us in the event of our country going communist. Our government indeed had fallen into low respect, and Castro had assumed high respect in Latin America. On December the 29th, 1962, President Kennedy, John Kennedy, met with the survivors of the Bay of Pigs Brigade in Miami's Orange Bowl. He had their flag with him. And here's a picture of President Kennedy holding that flag. You can see the flag in the middle and Kennedy's on the left. Kennedy told the survivors, 80,000 people in the Orange Bowl, number 20, I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade, meaning the Bay of Pigs Invasion Brigade, in a free Havana. Kennedy said, we are going to make sure that Castro falls. I can promise that. And we will see that if you support my government. The flag was never delivered. Kennedy went to Dallas, Texas, less than a year later and never returned. Kennedy was assassinated. And I believe one of the reasons he was assassinated was because he wanted truthfully to assist the Cubans to destroy communism in their homeland. And Castro remains in power, and Cuba remains communist, just as planned. Herbert Matthews, by the way, ending, was elevated to the editorial board of the newspaper for his fine reporting job in the mountains of Sierra Maestra and in his articles about Fidel Castro. I'd like to end now because we're running out of time. Next week we'll continue our study of the, in fact we're going to change the subject next week to central banking, and we're going to study how bankers create paper money out of nothing and then loan it to the government at interest. So with that then I'd like to invite you to tune in again next week as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.